What is it that makes a community last? It's a big question, right? For anybody who starts an organization, for anybody who is interested in being a part of something that's been here for a long time, we have perhaps the same sort of foundational questions. How do you make something last? And that is an interesting perspective that we're given in today's chapter, which is, by the way, a very sort of like poetic exploration of the Little Gidding community. The ideas for our discussion today is not going to really center so much upon the content of the chapter as the key concepts that are brought out by it, because the example of the history of Little Gidding is such an interesting little place as it comes to this bigger question of what does it mean to live in community? You've seen probably the trajectory over the past couple of live streams we've done on this book, The Vowed Life, that the re-examination of what it means to live as a vowed Christian is going to center around this renewed interest in monasticism on the one hand, but on the other hand, the renewed interest in communal living is sort of undergirding some of these discussions, even our discussions of church. When we talk about baptism, confirmation, ordination, vowed monastic life, marriage, we all have talked about those concepts, those sacramental concepts, those sacramental realities, not as individual activities. They are communal activities. And the particular type of community that we do those activities in could be the kind of everyday church, but also could be intentional communities, which is what our author uses in this chapter to describe the communities that have chosen a specific way of life to live together. And those intentional communities are a broader term, a broader umbrella, so to speak, to talk about not just church, not just monasticism in the sort of institutional sense, but rather in the more idiosyncratic sense that we have in today's example of the Little Gidding community. Just as a quick sort of overview of what exactly we're talking about today, the Little Gidding community is it's a little township that is in the Diocese of Ely in England, and it is, let's say, a sort of inauspicious countryside town that, from the sort of outside looking in, wouldn't seem to be anything out of the ordinary for the English countryside. And yet, the history of the community of Little Gidding is one that is deeply important for Anglicans, those of the Church of England, and likewise, in a lot of ways, for those who are looking for examples of communities that last long after the original founders of the communities have passed away. And what gives Little Gidding that staying power is probably the best way to describing this is homegrown spirituality, but not just individual spirituality. It's not just that I, as a particular person living in a particular place, have a particular spirituality, but rather that it is a spirituality that is communally centered, but that is also meant to serve the everyday lay Christian. And examples of those communities lasting are quite few in number. Probably the best example we have of this is the order of Benedictines that we have in the Benedictine lay communities within the wider church. But Little Gidding is an interesting example of one of those. It began with the friendship between two particular families, the Ferrers, and likewise the sort of school-age contemporaries of Ferrer, and the chosen example of wanting to be able to live in an intentional lay community that was centered around common worship, common prayer, was one that could have been perfectly understood as part of how the English church expressed itself, especially with the Book of Common Prayer, right? But the family-centered spirituality of the Ferrers, Nicholas Ferrer particularly, was interested in a more, I wouldn't say institutional, but rather a more disciplined, we would say a rule of prayer that is very much monastic in type. Basically a daily routine, a daily rhythm of prayer that also was dotted by the everyday doings of the family. In a way, Little Gidding attempted, and in a lot of ways was successful in some of its iterations, of taking the monastic model and applying it to the family social structure. And in that way, it provides some innovation, but also some question as to what is the right way to do or to form one of these family-centric communities. And instead of going into the details of the history of the Little Gidding community, which you can read in this chapter perfectly well, rather instead, let's talk about the main concepts that seem to have given Little Gidding its lasting potential. Just to be completely clear, by the way, there is no specific community that is active in Little Gidding at this moment. However, over the course of the history of that place, there is a particularly special spirituality that those who make pilgrimages to Little Gidding will readily tell you is present. And what we're hoping to talk about today is why Little Gidding has such a lasting presence, and maybe what the big pieces of that puzzle are. So, what does it take for a community to have lasting presence, and what should we consider whenever we are maybe thinking about undertaking some sort of community project like the new monastic project that was Little Gidding before we even had the term new monasticism? There are three things that the headings of our chapter mark out as things that are, or at least seem to be, essential for the community of Little Gidding. And one of the things that we need to first start out with is maybe the obvious, which is structure. In first place, the structure of the community is one that adopts the monastic structure of daily prayer and work. This is directly out of the Benedictine community sort of ora et labora. It's the common thing that we talk about when we talk about Benedictine spirituality is prayer and work. There are set hours of prayer. There were set hours of prayer for the community of families that lived there. Nicholas Ferrer was very insistent that there be a regular time of prayer for the household to observe, and not just a regular time of prayer that might be a good idea sometimes, or might be a part of your spiritual devotion. Instead, we need to recognize that when Little Gidding, the community at Little Gidding, under Nicholas Ferrer, was beginning its existence, this was during the time of some fairly intense wrangling between the Puritans, who are going to be much more non-institutional, personally pietistic, and very suspicious of anything structured. And likewise, on the other hand, you have the rest of the Church of England, which is going to be deeply institutional and deeply suspicious of any type of activity that goes beyond the regular hours of prayer at church. So Little Gidding tries for a via media, or a middle way between these things, in which the important part of this, by the way, is that this is in the household. Okay, so in household. This is the key here. This one is the big one. Okay, it is in the household that this happens. And because it is in the household, it is a familial sort of family structure. Again, back to structure here. And because of that, we have to recognize that this is a domestic setting for a regular rotation of prayer and work. We are domesticating, in a lot of ways, the monastic sort of expression. And in a way, we're walking a fine line between the profession of a monastic vow and, on the other hand, the sort of, we would quote-unquote call secular daily living. But that's not how the Pharaohs understood this, that there's no such thing as quote-unquote secular living. Rather, there is holy living that has to do with the way that we structure our everyday. But it also had to do with the place in which we did it, okay? So there was a particular place at which these things happen. So daily prayer and work right here are not just sort of ethereal, I guess I'll do it whenever I'm in my chair one day, or I guess I'll do it whenever I'm sitting at breakfast the next. That the place of these things, while being domestic, was also intentional. So, domestic but intentional. It was not simply that the members of the household had their own sort of individual practices. But not only that, the members of the household also had common places at which they all prayed together the common daily prayer. So, in the same way that Benedictines will have the chapel, in which all of the monastics will go to the chapel to say their daily hours of prayer together, so also we have the daily intentional same place of prayer, but it is in a domestic setting. In other words, we are all gathering together as a family unit to go to a specific place in the household structure to say our set prayers, our daily prayers together, and to be able to then go about our work in the domestic setting, not in what we would call an ecclesial setting. So the intentional community of the Legating also understood that it had to be a community. And while that might seem silly to say here, we have to recognize it's a community in which this thing has taken place. Okay? There is a specific structure to the way that all this works, but the community also had a specific place in which it occurs. And the reason why the tensions between, like we talked about a couple weeks ago, dispersed communities, communities that don't have a centralized location to be, such as some of the expressions of new monasticism. One of the things that becomes a complication in those dispersed communities is this idea of place. This, by the way, is a deeply Benedictine thing. If you read St. Benedict's Rule, or if you want to actually go and watch one of our previous Theology Thursday series over St. Benedict's Rule, you can find that in your playlist. One of the things that Benedict is insistent upon, is that the monastics remain in the place where they start. Benedict is extremely suspicious of people who simply hop from monastery to monastery. He has a metaphor that he used in his book. It's like someone is a plant without any soil. basically, that keeps hopping and hopping and hopping and never grows roots, never grows a plant. In the same sort of way, Nicholas Ferrer was very insistent about this place being a community. It was not simply, oh, we're a community tied across time and space, which again, it's not to say that communities can't be formed that way, but Ferrer's insistence is that it took on a specific place. It had to have a specific real space in which it happened, okay? And because of this, we have to deal with the third interesting thing about this, which is time. It's not just that we have structure and place, but we have to recognize what exactly are we dealing with whenever we talk about time. And this becomes the historical question of Little Gidding, okay? This is one of the more interesting points, because after Nicholas Ferrer and the families that were a part of the Little Gidding community die, move away, the lasting spiritual effect of that community is one in which gets picked back up in the 20th century. And it's interesting that this cycle of holiness is what we'll call this. This cycle of holiness, of a place that has been a set-apart holy place for a specific time, and likewise England in the 1600s, we'd say, yet this time cycling back around to when we hit the 20th century, we have a lot of people who are, by the natural movement of the Holy Spirit, seeking intentional community again, then pick back up those things that have been tested, tried, and true, such as the things that Little Gidding was doing. And this cycle of holiness, in which roughly we could say is cycling around innovation on the one hand, and tradition on the other. And back around again. This being one of the things that we see happening in the history of Little Gidding. In the time, we have an innovation. We have the adopting of the monastic structure into a domestic setting. But whenever we then cycle into the normalization of this, or really the sort of loyalty to the place, we then have this deep-rooted spirituality that, again, as the author notes, when we talk about Englishness, that we look at Little Gidding and it's very English. That on the one hand, we can talk about it as being English because, of course, it's in England and it expresses the English culture. But it also expresses the English culture at a particular point in time, at a particular space in history, at a particular sort of insistence of a certain kind of family structure. But also at the same time, they are responding to a number of things happening around the community, right? That part in the chapter where he talks about the people who were not happy with the Little Gidding community, who would come in and try to cause trouble, and things like that, that they were responding to the Puritans on the one side and the institutionalists on the other side. That both of these people had various issues with the ways in which this community was functioning, even though Nicholas Ferrer understood that this was simply Christian living, that there wasn't anything to be said either pro or against institutional or Puritan tendencies. And in fact, I don't think Ferrer would have been comfortable in bifurcating either of those things from each other. Instead, he was looking for a way in which we can live fully intentional lives in communities together, and likewise be able to do so in an effective manner as just a Christian, not as a Puritan Christian or as a Church of England Christian, but rather as just a basic Christian person. Okay, but I'm changing my marker here because we're now going to talk about how the 20th century picks this up, okay? So when we get to this particular point in time here, time becomes very interesting because while we have this sort of innovation tradition thing going on here, we also are going to be meeting into the challenges of what it means for a community to last, okay? So will innovation last? Is a big question that we should have of this community, because we know that over the centuries we've had the beginnings of something special. We've then had it sort of fall by the wayside. We then had a revival within the 20th century. Then we've had it fall by the wayside again. And in a lot of ways, the challenge of these innovative communities, and again, I use the term communities because, again, we're emphasizing how does a community last today, okay? These innovations in these communities, the lasting power, in a lot of ways, might actually come back to this question of structure. Because no matter what type of innovation you might have, when we have structures in place so that there is some level of tradition that comes alongside of that innovation, okay, we then are kind of, again, institutionalizing. And again, that word institutional is not a bad word. It simply means that we have a sort of agreed upon structure of how we're going to govern ourselves, okay? Church is one of those things. Little Gidding is one of those things. And it's just that are those structures built to last, basically? And one of the things that our author notes that is a big challenge to whether a community will last is, do we have an appropriate separation of responsibilities? In fact, that was one of the things that he talked about in the unfortunate lawsuits that became a huge issue with some of these other upstart communities that have come in the 20th century. The question of structure is also a question of administration. And as boring as that word might sound, right in the middle of it, right in the middle of the word administration is the word ministry. And because administration is in fact part of the ministry, in fact, the word administer, or to be an administrator of something like that, administration is a word that we get a close a close synonym of in the Bible, which is the word bishop. Okay? And in the bishop of the local community, of local monastic communities, is simply called the abbot or the prioress. And in St. Benedict's rule, there were some very stringent responsibilities and requirements of choosing an abbot or prioress. Okay? And in these sorts of innovations, it seems to be that these new monastic communities, or these intentional communities, the intentional communities that have the most clear and obvious ways of selecting an administrator, someone who is going to be the administrator of the community, that has an appropriate delineation of powers and checks and balances, such that St. Benedict had in his particular rule of life, that in a lot of ways, if the structure of the community has a solid administration and set qualifications, those are the communities that tend to last. Because as Benedict notes in his rule in the written in the 500s, the selection of someone who is going to be the spiritual father or mother of the community is an extremely important decision, and one that has to have all kinds of ways to mitigate disastrous choices. In fact, when you read St. Benedict's rule, you could basically say that St. Benedict was either a realist or a pessimist when it comes to the community's ability to choose a good abbot. In fact, when Benedict goes down his qualifications for abbots and prioresses, he says that don't look at their outside, don't look at how well they speak, don't look at how well they lead the liturgies, don't look at anything else than is God calling this person. And don't look at anything else than does the community discern that this is the person for the job. Because St. Benedict basically says, the eyes, the ears, the heart is deceitful. You will make all kinds of bad choices that seem like good choices at first. So if the structure is able to have good administration and set qualifications, those are the things that tend to last. And the places that tend to last are the places that have stability. Being in one place, growing the plant in one soil, staying in this community for perpetuity. That is a key thing about communities that last. And hence why we have pilgrims and pilgrimages that go to Little Gidding, even though we might not have the same sort of set structure in the cycle of holiness that we had had in the past. We still have the place, and that place is either a reminder or a living example of intentional community. The stability of the place is deeply important to the survival of those communities. Can we stay in one place? Can we stay in this place? And I think that this actually has a lot of import when we think about church planting. Because when we think about church planting, one of the really important questions we have to ask ourselves is, why are we thinking about a church plant in this place? And then number two, we have to ask ourselves, is God calling us to put something in this place at this time? It's like, for example, the community that I live in here in Searcy, Arkansas. There are all kinds of churches around the area that have come from other churches that were planted here. And in the process of establishing those congregations, there was a specific sense that there was a growing community of people that were being underserved, or even better, that could be served better by establishing their own institutional community that would have their own sort of flavor to this big general structure that would then give on some particularly, we have this term domestic here, unique expressions. So, one of the things about the innovation of the community at Little Gidding was the domestication of it, the domestication of the monastic way of structuring things. One of the other things about communities that last in stability is that they have stable sorts of things that then institutionalize this innovation. And there are all kinds of things that can go well or go badly in that. Because whenever you have innovations that get brought into a stable place with unique expressions, but in a particular sort of way of traditionalizing them, we can, on the one hand, lose connection to what made them unique in the first place. However, there's also some benefits to this, however, because the institutional administrative structure might actually fix some problems of these new innovative communities that likewise might not be able to see the problems coming down the road. To use the example of the leadership issues in some of the kind of wider new monastic communities, one of the things that we see over and over again is that, especially in the 20th century, we in the United States, in England, in a lot of the places within Europe, we have rightly developed a deeply suspicious relationship with these institutions because of the fact that we know that abuses have historically been perpetrated in them. And in fact, abuses that have been covered up for many victims have been perpetrated in institutions like these, okay? However, to simply look at the institutions as if they're the bad guys, we probably should take a look at those innovative communities that have also suffered deep abuses by either lack of administration or by the sort of paragon champion of the innovator of the cause, and that innovator also falling victim to hero complexes or being spiritually abusive to those who are underneath them. It's not an institutional problem. It's not a uniquely institutional problem. It's a uniquely human problem. And in a lot of ways, the stability of the place involves administration. These two are deeply connected. The stability of the place itself is a direct result of the administrative oversight. And as Little Gidding, again, there's never anything positive that comes out of lawsuits. In a lot of ways, there are things that have to be fixed, and that's what lawsuits are. They're ways to fix injustice. But there's still some deep recovery and deep hurt that end up happening on either side. But all I have to say is that if we look at the Little Gidding community and the successes and failures of some of the attempts to restart or reimagine the community, it really falls to the sort of interplay between the institution that knows how to deal with some of these issues, doesn't perfectly deal with them, but knows how to deal with these issues, and the unique expression resisting that administrative tendency. So there's some gray area in that relationship. But time, on this side right here, time is a both and. Time is a both and when it comes to the physical community of a specific period of time and past and future communities in the same place, okay? So we might take place as being like, okay, that's the place. But that place, like I'm standing right here in the nave of Trinity Episcopal Church in Searcy, Arkansas. This building that I'm standing in has been standing since 1904. And the place in which I'm standing is the same place, but it is most definitely not the same time as 1904, right? I'm looking out at the pews right now, and there have been soldiers that have passed through here that have gone on to die in World War I and World War II. There are people who have been in these pews that are no longer here that I don't even know their names. And yet at the same place, at the same place that I am right now, there is this intersection between the before, the now, and the coming. So there's a both and relationship between past, present, and future. There is a both and relationship between what I am doing now in this particular place, what has been done in this particular place, and what will be done in this particular place in the future. And this actually has everything to do with holiness, by the way. Because the lasting thing about the Little Gidding community is the fact that people recognize it as a holy place. A holy place in the past, a holy place in the present, and a holy place that continues to be so for the future. Regardless of what exactly is going on in Little Gidding at this particular minute, on, Thursday in August, one of the things that we can nonetheless say is that it is a holy place by virtue of time, past, present, future. And so we are all caught up in this, this kind of wonderful soup, this delicious stew of structure, place, and time that not only is particular to a specific point in time, the creation of the community by Nicholas Ferrer, but is also continuously steeping and cooking and becoming more fragrant and flavorful as we have the passage of time by virtue of the people who were there, the people who are there, and the people who will be there. So what does it take for a community to last? It takes a mysterious combination of these three big things that have to balance each other in some parts, but in some ways kind of give way to the next. It's hard to have an administrative structure if you don't know where and when. It's hard to have a place if you don't know what's going on and what time we're talking about. And likewise, time is that sort of flow in which all of these sorts of physical things take place. Time is the vehicle by which these sort of actions are delivered in the grand scheme of things. But a sort of combination between structure, place, and time, all of those things are absolutely necessary for communities, intentional communities, monastic communities, structures, other things like that, absolutely essential for the survival of those organizations. So where that leaves us is maybe a helpful way of us thinking about our own communities. And not just that, but thinking about what it means to be a vowed part of a specific community of people. If I'm a vowed baptized Christian, regardless of whether we think of vows as being, again, like institutional or not, like, for example, regardless of whether I'm an Episcopalian as a part of the Episcopal Church, or whether you are a part of the Baptist Church, there are vows that we take, whether we call them that or not, which is that I believe that Jesus, died for me and has raised me to newness of life by virtue of what he has accomplished. And I believe that. I have faith in that. And in that way, we are confessing to the community gathered that we are taking on that identity, that responsibility of living as a Christian. Regardless of what denominational tag you want to put on there, we all are under vows within communities, not individually. We are under communal vows of which we are living together in these intentional communities. We are in some cases, we are voluntarily giving up our freedom to do otherwise so that we might be able to live a good life, the good vowed life. And in communities like Little Gidding, it was an innovation that caused a new sort of intentional communities to sort of find its expression in the Holy Spirit. Real Christians were called in real times to express themselves in real ways, and those ways by virtue of the working of the Spirit and by virtue of really the structure, place and time of what's going on has allowed those places to continuously be examples of holiness for us. And hopefully, we hope, will continue to be examples of holiness for us. Great examples of this are the communities that we no longer have that continually are understood as holy places. There are some great examples in the countryside of England where there are monasteries that have been destroyed due to Henry VIII's destruction of the monasteries that still have the great stone apses that are there. And there's this wonderful one that has a big lawn in the middle of it. That's this ruins of a great monastic house. People still go there on pilgrimage because they recognize it is a holy place. Regardless of whether it has a roof on it or not, they recognize it is a holy place that was set aside for a holy purpose, and that mysteriously, even though there's not a roof over their heads, even though it's in a remote place where there's not anybody left, it's still a place that is holy. Those communities, even though they're long gone, still, and I wouldn't even say they're vestiges, I would say that they're actually sort of like slumbering places that still have this powerful, this really almost intuitive understanding of holiness about them that is palpable in the tangible sense, that is hard to describe unless you actually go to the place itself. But think about how this structure, time, and place is indicative of the ways that we do church. We do it that way and have done it that way for a long time, but we also have innovations in the styles in which we do those things, right? My community here in the 21st century in Searcy, Arkansas looks nothing like the churches in the 200s or 300s AD, with the exceptions of perhaps the worship and the liturgy. But we, in many ways, innovate, traditionalize, and we house these perfectly good holy expressions of the Spirit in our structures, our places, and our times. And whether those things will last is a function of the intentionality of the sort of longevity of the structure itself. But even after all of that, it really is up to God himself as to whether those communities survive. We pray, just like we do in every single place where the church is, that of course the church will continue until Christ comes back. And likewise, when Christ comes back to collect his bride, that he will find us working, and he'll find us faithful in the various structures, times, and places in which we all find ourselves residing in.